Welcome to the Herbal Hour Podcast. Today we have Frank Piccirillo. He's a naturopathic medical student going to the lovely school NUNM, which I just recently graduated from. Me and Frank have been friends for a bit of time. We've been talking about doing this episode and talking about sacred plant medicine, shamanism, the placebo effect, and many other great things. So how did you get into the healing path? Like, what originally got you interested in practicing natural medicine? So for people who aren't aware, NUNM, it's the National University of Natural Medicine. It's one of the largest in the country schools graduating naturopathic doctors who are actually licensed in many states. But the foundation of it is based on natural healing. So what brought you into the natural healing path? I know you had a very interesting journey getting into it. Not exactly
Wonderful.
100% typical.
Yeah. Well, I guess first I want to say thank you for having me on here. It's a pleasure. And congratulations on graduating, man. It's wonderful.
Thank you. It feels great.
That same day. Yeah, I'm sure. And, it's wonderful to be a student at NUNM. It definitely, I would say I might have had an atypical journey getting there, but I think there isn't really a typical journey that draws one towards that kind of profession. But yeah, I originally, I guess, got into the world of medicine and plant medicine, supplements, biohacking, I guess you could even say, through what I realized to be some pathologies or physical maladies and mental and emotional maladies that I had that I knew I wanted to work out if I needed to move forward in my life. So there was, physical motivation, emotional, medical to treat myself. And then when you see that an effective treatment, whatever it is, you feel kind of compelled to share that with others around you, because you're like, wow, this worked. This is a beautiful solution potentially to some of the problems that the world is facing. And yeah, in general, I think from what I've gathered that naturopathic medicine should represent is a beautiful new paradigm in medicine where I think the system is headed towards, and I'm excited to be a part of that whole shift. But yeah, it originally, I guess, got inspired when I was in college, trying to bring my brain capacity up to its highest focal point so I could be best in school and life, right? And then later down the road, realized I was having some physical issues, a lot of muscle and back pain, and then was diagnosed with spondylolisthesis, great word, which really just means your sacrum is slipping off your lumbar and your spine, and that was causing me chronic pain. Getting the diagnosis for it was freeing and weird in a way. I also had a fracture on my L5, and how do I treat that sustainably? In our conventional medical paradigm, there really wasn't much. I saw a chiropractor. He was like, you have this, there's no curing it. And even in our naturopathic school, I remember in anatomy when they brought up spondylolisthesis, there was no cure. However, I think from whatever techniques I have utilized over the past 6 months, I've gotten to a place where even my chiropractor says, like, you might not fit the bill or the statistical criteria for spondylolisthesis anymore. So yeah, I got a lot of value through learning about different herbs, supplements, and what our world would define as drugs right now that truly helped my progression, both mentally, emotionally, and physically. And that's what drew me towards realizing I want to share this with everyone and fully learn the mysterious nature of the human form.
So we're talking now about sacred plant medicines, medicines that have been used, for thousands, perhaps even longer years for giving guidance, inducing visions, and healing people on a psychospiritual level. It's interesting now. So there's a lot of new research going on around psilocybin, and there's on previous podcasts I had guests on where we talked about the new initiatives of getting psilocybin on the ballot as a medical treatment for depression, anxiety, PTSD, etc. It actually is on the ballot from what I understand. So that's a nice step forward. But in general, I think this field of using these plant medicines for healing is so important right now because the fundamental illnesses of our time seem to be more psychospiritual. Like
Yeah.
modern medicine seems to have figured out most things, like can,
Hmm.
preserve life. You get in an accident, you have some severe disease. There's an answer for, it's not necessarily, the ultimate answer, the best answer in many cases.
Right.
It has some answer for the physical body, but for the mind and spirit, we are we have less knowledge about how to treat the mind and spirit in some ways
Hmm.
than maybe was known thousands of years ago, where that, separation wasn't present.
Yeah, I completely agree in that. Modern medicine does have the capacity to treat what we wholly understand about the body, which is, I think, a small fraction of what we really are. A lot of us is, in my opinion, energetic form, which translates into a physical form and has a emotional and mental interface between the two. And what we understand about it, I think, is very limited. And so our scope of how we treat that is limited. And I think that's largely held back by the dogmatism that is in science right now. It is, everything has to be proven with a double-blind, placebo-controlled experiment, which is beautiful that we have a system like that, but it becomes dogmatic to a extent because, lack of evidence is not evidence of lack or something like. What's the
Mm-hmm.
evidence
Right, that makes sense.
of yes. So, lack of evidence is not an evidence that it's not there. So because we cannot fully explain how our emotional or energetic body translates to physical pathology, that doesn't mean it doesn't. And I think we are seeing a zeitgeist right now where we're starting to accept that plant medicine can translate to immense and potent physical healing and mental healing and emotional. And that legislation that was put forth by the Oregon Psilocybin Society, I think, is very transformative and a beautiful progression, in my opinion. For those of you I'm not sure the listener profile right now, but psilocybin, right, is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, so it is vernacularly called. And over the past 10 or so years, there's been what people have described as a psychedelic renaissance, or the new revolution of psychedelics, in opening up to what's the medical value in these plants or the substances. Some of them are synthetic, actually. And how do we then prove to the medical institution with double-blind, placebo-controlled experiments that these medicines can work? And that's proven difficult, but there are some amazing people out there like Robin Carhart Harris and, Stan Groff back in the day, and Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS, who are trying to piecemeal all of these different ideas together into some sort of proof that, yes, these medicines are valuable in the medical context.
And there's a lot of research coming out that there is some efficacy for them. Like we were talking a little bit before about MDMA assisted psychotherapies and some new research that's coming around on psilocybin therapies and also ketamine therapies. And they are actually finding some pretty remarkable results in terms of treating conditions that are thought to be untreatable, like, major depression that doesn't respond to any antidepressants, PTSD that's very severe. And it's fascinating too, because from what I've heard and read, there's a big interest even within the medical model for these therapies. So it seems that a lot of the reason why psychedelic research kind of went underground is because of the federal regulations and the war on drugs. Whereas during the late 60s, early 70s, every psychiatrist wanted to see what is this magical thing that apparently heals people from major depression from a few uses or certain things like that. And even in today's day, there seems to be a wide interest and curiosity even among the conventional medicine in terms of psychiatrists who are seeking the best for their patient, because they're looking for good options. Let's be honest, man. Mental health treatment in the conventional sphere it's so
Needs a help.
lacking, and everyone knows it, including the people, who use those medications, because they see, of course, antidepressants help certain people for sure. They're really helpful, acutely for, but they're kind of like a little bit of a Band-Aid, because, they can help you have like the stability and the foundation to make those mentality changes, those lifestyle changes, those habit changes that can lead to health. But they in of themselves, the problem with any medication that you have to always take is you can't really be considered healing, because you always need it. So even if you are in a better state from it, that means you're still dependent on it, which means,
I think that's part and parcel of the conventional paradigm that we live in today. Conventional medical paradigm is that our treatment is symptomatically based and derived. So you can treat a condition for the moment, but that's not getting to the root cause, which is another thing that really drew me to naturopathic medicine, because I wasn't getting sustained treatment from any of the conventional approaches that I was given for whatever malady it was. And I am convinced that that is a large part of the reason that these medicines have not garnered public or legitimate traction for so long, because how do you, like I said, quantize some of these values in a study, in a double-blind placebo-controlled study, and then the motivation for it to be used as a treatment fiscally for larger corporations and the medical institution is not there, because for instance, there's one study that was looking at psilocybin mushrooms and depression, and they noted a variety of psychological markers and factors and how they shifted in the experimental group who received the mushrooms. And they or actually, I think they received straight psilocybin, but they saw that their openness was one factor, and their depression had lifted and sustained for 15 months. On average, the average person in that study who they checked 15 months later had still had an openness factor 2 times greater than what it previously was. So they're open to new ideas and experiences that threaten their current view of reality, which I think is fundamental in exploring why you are in a certain emotional holding pattern, right? It allows novel thought forms and neurogenesis in atypical ways.
That's a really good point in terms of healing, right? So usually, there's a lack of wellness or some kind of disease because of all of the many unseen factors that play into it, the deep patterns, the ways of thinking, the ways of acting, and they all kind of work together to either produce health or disease. But from within that pattern, it's almost impossible to see it, because even your idea of how you can fix it might just be part of the pattern. It might just be another pathological expression of that same process. So that's a really good point.
Entirely the case in my case.
Break from that pattern and have openness to find new solutions or new ways of acting that you would have never thought of, right?
Yes. Yeah, for sure. In treating my spondylolisthesis, I'm a very forward action, do things to cure yourself and move forward sort of person. And ironically, what I realized in a lot of ways to relax myself and my musculature required non-action, and patience in these slower modalities. But yeah, I definitely had a lot to say about everything you said prior. I came into this sort of discussion when I was probably a student at my original undergrad. I went to Northeastern University in Boston, where my undergrad was in chemical engineering, obviously a completely different field. And I lost interest in that, and it didn't feel like I could serve the people correctly. Maybe, making pharmaceuticals or oil didn't sit right with me. But while I was there, I got involved in a wonderful organization that's federally recognized called the Students for Sensible Drug Policy. And I was an activist in drug reform. And it is a very polarized and hot yet important issue right now. And that was in 2010 when I started the first psychedelic conference So we got, medical speakers to come and speak about the value of psychedelics in 2010. And that's since been an annual tradition at Northeastern now. But it was difficult to get $2,000 from Northeastern University to fly Rick Doblin in to talk about how LSD and mushrooms are medicine, because there's this unfortunate branding that occurred when the drug war came into play. And I think to separate our understanding of plant medicine and psychedelics from the political environment and the drug war is misguided, because our perception of it has been branded throughout the years of the public view, right? So I find it like obligatory for folks like yourself, and I, potentially bringing in hopefully a new paradigm of medical treatment, to rebrand and recontextualize the medicines that unfortunately got painted as a drug when the 60s and 70s came about and people were using them irresponsibly. Now we have a lot of practitioners, even like you said, in popular culture, who are studying these medicines, who are finding value in these medicines, in the scientific paradigm and placebo-controlled studies, and proving to the rest of the folks in that community that this isn't just a hogwash conversation for those who want drugs legalized. The value in regulation and exploration of the capacity of these drugs is far greater than our, fun to use them. That's not what it's about for almost all the people in the activist community that I've met. And why is that? Because much of them have had valuable experiences, as myself, and that brings even more of an impetus to feel the need to share that.
That's a really key thing with the healing effects of psychedelics, specifically plant medicines that have a long tradition of use, is that something about the experience itself is therapeutic and healing. So there is obviously pharmacological effects, and there's all sorts of differences on neuroplasticity, and there's studies looking at, EEGs, basically like brain scans, seeing that there's all sorts of different activity, areas of the brain lighting up that are usually pretty dormant during waking hours, things like that. So there are those effects, but at the same time, the experience of it is therapeutic, or can be, in the same way I think that any kind of deep experience can be. Any kind of, in traditional society, like initiation rituals, different like rites of passage, we still have them. They're in a super watered down form now. We still have birthdays and bar mitzvahs and graduations from school.
Right. Boy, they really represent. Where's the juice in it?
Exactly. They tend to be missing a lot of the original kind of archetypal force that they had in where they were more a part of the culture. Now they're more like remnants. They're more like remnants of an older time where they had more meaning.
And that's what's happened. Unfortunately, the psychedelic drug culture, when they were originally released to the public without really an understanding of what they were. People are going to take MDMA and go to a rave and have a great time, but that doesn't necessarily.
And then the roots were taken away, and that became the meme of usage, that you only use these things to party or for fun, whereas there's this many thousand year tradition of using them for spiritual insights, for guidance, for transformation. And those approaches are very different too, because they involve a lot of preparatory work. They involve, doing certain preparations before you ingest certain plant medicines over weeks. Sometimes they involve setting intentions. They involve intricate rituals of dance and music and chants, and so much more than just, casually taking something and then, going to a party or, with some friends, or like completely different context of usage. And I think the context of usage that's where the healing effect can come in, where it's used in proper healing context.
Yes, I completely agree. I think it is wonderfully viewed through a lens of what's happening right now in the PTSD and MDMA studies. That was luckily one of the people that we were blessed enough to have come and speak at Northeastern in 2010 was Michael Mithoffer, the wonderful man who is the penchant and had the original guts and idea to pitch using MDMA as a therapeutic treatment to the government and he had to jump through a ton of hoops to try and get that as an FDA approved trial. Which I have many things to say about that as well. But yes, he is now, I think, completed or in phase 3 of his studies. And what they noted was that, the experience of MDMA in a therapeutic setting is far more value to pathological neuroses than going to a rave or doing it with your girlfriend. Maybe there have been, and I'm sure I'm sure that there have been, because I can vouch, beautiful lessons and transformative shifts that have happened from people using it outside of a therapeutic medical context. It happens from the pharmacology of the drug itself. You don't need anything else. But when you add in that therapeutic context and understanding of how exactly this medicine works, it really opens up the doors for how it can be utilized as a medicine. So in his study in particular, they took patients who statistically met the criteria for PTSD and had them in a therapeutic therapist counselor session using I think it was 200 milligram dose of MDMA. And the value was in the MDMA, but it was more so in the person's capacity, or not even capacity. It opens you up to vulnerability and empathy, whether you're trying or not. You become more vulnerable under the influence of MDMA. So you can imagine the value of that in a therapeutic context, right? Especially for those in PTSD. I have this traumatic event that is stored in my body, in my opinion, in my muscles somewhere. I can't look at that with a therapist though, because every time I do, I start to maybe have a PTSD event. And MDMA prevents that tension and allows the patient to explore what is really going on in my neuroses, my default mode network, which is an important idea to understand about the way the brain thinks on default. What are your ruminations? And how can I walk out of this narrow paradigm of thought that I've been in? And that's, they have now gotten to phase 3 studies, and the numbers are mind-blowing, beautiful. Control group with placebo had, I think it was 23% participants did not meet the statistical criterion for PTSD after their session. But with MDMA and a therapist, they, as opposed to just a therapist, they moved to 54% of patients, no longer for a duration of time, over a year, did not show that they met the criteria for PTSD.
So
that's a lasting solution.
It was comparing patients who got MDMA and psychotherapy versus patients who just got psychotherapy?
Yes.
Okay.
Got psychotherapy, also got a placebo. So there's a placebo effect to work into it, which is very powerful in my opinion. And so that value of how we can redefine and explore the brain through psychedelics is something that, like I said, has now become a renaissance and a new golden age of psychedelics. And again, I think it was Stan Grof, one of the old original people who was doing research in psychedelics back before it was made illegal in the 70s and 60s. He had said that psychedelics are to psychology what the telescope was to astronomy. And I completely agree. We are having a window into how the brain works, and to see for the person itself, it's valuable in that way because you can see how your brain works without the subjective layer of what you are. And it's very important in our modern society because we are going through a period of time, particularly for MDMA, I'll just use as one example, where using these medicines can noticeably affect our society pretty instantly. It's how many United States veterans kill themselves every day is unfortunately mind-blowing. And we have a therapy out there that is now approved by the FDA, but isn't being accepted by the public because these medicines are painted in an unfortunate way. The amount of people dying from armed conflict is greater than that of all natural disasters, and then for the past 10 years or something like that. So obviously there's value in exploring not just the physical changes that can happen, but how can we re-understand ourselves as a culture? Maybe this could shift and put more peace into our view of things, and that's just one of the millions of benefits that these medicines could have. And it's such a relief to see now. It's like 10 years after I did that psychedelic conference, like we now have the Oregon Psilocybin Society, like you mentioned. Their ballot IP 34 will be on the ballot in November, and that is to vote for the clinical therapeutic use of psilocybin in a controlled setting. So it'd be a trained practitioner. The legislation proposes that there would be a trained practitioner who is trained under Oregon and supplies mushrooms from Oregon to any person who wants to experience the medicine and does not have any health comorbidities like hypertension or schizophrenia. That's pretty much it. And they can go to the practitioner and experience this medicine legally. That'd be the first place in the world to have legal use written into law. So the implications of that, how the United States sets the tone for the drug war and drug legalization, I think that is going to be a massive shift in consciousness and perception about these substances, which will open it up to even further understanding and value. So I'm excited about things to come.
Yeah, and those are just the medicines and substances that we know of now, and
you're right.
Those are just the traditions that we know of now. Many have been forgotten. Many are still yet to be discovered. Many are still yet to evolve and be even created in a sense, because plants are, growing and we're in a symbiotic relationship with them. So it's not they're finished. So
nature is a better chemist than any human will ever be.
That's right. Well, that's why we have to use nature.
Most alkaloids from plants rather than make them synthetically, because they do it way quicker and easier than we can.
Yeah, and they don't need much, just some light and some water. We need fancy manufacturing facilities and tons of workers. And
it is very interesting.
So what do you think? So there's a lot of debate on these psychoactive substances, why they exist in plants. Why do you think they exist in plants? These different psychoactive compounds. Certain plants have them a lot. Some have none.
I think that plant intelligence is implicit in our understanding of health. If we really want to go further towards truth, we have become a part of our environment. We have a living biome of bacteria that has shifted over the years as the bacterial environment has shifted. In that same way, we have grown accustomed, and our physiology has grown to be relatable to the environments around us. For instance, we have an endocannabinoid system. I think that the part of the reason cannabis is such an effective medicine is because our body potentially evolved using this medicine for thousands of years, and now it's a part of us. And I think same goes for so many herbal remedies. And we're now just beginning to entertain the idea that maybe there isn't craziness in the tribes of Amazon, the shamans there talking to the plants. I found that supremely interesting. I'm sure we'll talk about it a bit more, but I went to Peru with NUNM for a trip under the wonderful Dr. Stansberry. And we got to travel with a couple and I guess meet and learn about plant medicine from a few different tribes in the Amazon jungle right out of Cusco. And, it always used to blow my mind, like, how do these small tribes in the middle of the jungle know that this remedy works for this, What, did they just have one unlucky guy that had to test out all the medicines? Math doesn't add up.
Eating bark off trees and eating random
Right.
poisonous plants. And once in a while, the poisonous plant gives you visions. And other times it gives you visions that isn't poisonous. And those are the ones that we keep.
Well, that's a cumbersome way of figuring out how these medicines work, right? So I asked him, like, how do you guys know all this? Like, so much information about the flora and fauna around you. And a few of the people that I asked responded in a very calm and factual demeanor. We talk to the plants. And okay. So I went to that idea a bit further with one of the shamans who I got comfortable with. And he was like, yeah, each plant has a song that is associated with it, hence the Icaros song from Ayahuasca, combination of plants. But there is a song or resonance that is spoken from each plant, that if you are a person who's lived in the middle of the jungle and understood the herbal context of the world around you, they have a much easier time talking to the plants. And that's why, coming from a Western society and seeing that, being like, hey, you can't talk to the plants and get that information. But they say it's factual as if it's a simple thing, because they were, like I said, kind of grew up in this environment, and understand and accept, I think a lot of the problem for Westerners, accept that is a potential reality. If there is a resonance to each plant that can speak to you, and you are living in this world of plant medicine every day, you can potentially translate that resonance into, here's what it is, here's what it's useful for. And that's how they say they get the understanding of, like, and one that comes to mind is interesting is Datura is the only cure that they know of for this extremely poisonous snake. I think it's called the shushupi, and it kills you within minutes. You internally bleed. It's a horrible death. But if you can manage to brew up a batch of Datura, the strongest and most intense psychedelic that exists, and ingest it, you will live. And we spoke to this one person in the tribe, maybe in his teenager years, that had this happen to him at a young age and had to run back to his tribe and have his mother prepare a Datura soup. And then he had to take this incredibly crazy psychedelic, but he didn't die because he had this medicine.
That must have been a terrible experience, though. I've heard stories about Datura in general. It's not really necessarily
by a snake and dying.
Positive type of hallucinations as it is, but now when you're dying from a snake bite.
Outside of the context of snake bites and shushupi healing, I'm not sure Datura will be the first researched heavly psychedelic in the medical world, because it's really intense, and I've never done it.
It's interesting though, because in Carlos Castaneda's book, where he talks about Don Juan, one of the main herbs that they used within their shamanic tradition was Datura, but they had this incredibly incredibly complex system of, like, using it. They would first, take a piece of the root one day, the next you would take a piece of the plant, you would take a piece of this, then you would, like, plant it here, and you would do this, and then, they didn't even ingest any of this stuff in any noticeable quantity until several days and even weeks of doing these several processes. And I wonder if somehow they, got the body acclimated to it or desensitized to it, and then they prepare in a very particular way. So it's like this one substance that could be a terrible experience for somebody who just uses it willy-nilly can be a profoundly healing if first, if you have the proper cultural context, two, if you know the actual way to prepare it to get rid of the things that are harmful, the toxic substances, and retain the things that are helpful. And then even just get your body used to it and not just jump into it without having any understanding or experience of it beforehand.
I think that's a wonderful bridge into discussing the value of intention and a therapeutic environment. If one were to look to these drugs and substances and herbs as healing modalities. In particular, a good way of exploring that thought is through ayahuasca, right? It's a mix of two different plants, Banisterius caapi vine and chacruna or some other DMT containing plant, which, another tangent from what you noted before, it's supremely interesting that every living plant and thing on Earth contains a minuscule amount of DMT in it. What is the something speaks behind that, I think. But the active ingredient in ayahuasca is DMT combined with an MAOI, which prevents it from breaking down as it typically does in its smoked state. So, this is a brew that's made conventionally, or was typically used in the Amazon tribes for thousands of years, they say. And how did they now get to a point where most of the tribes have a similar traditional, what's the word I'm looking for, environment or intention or protocols? You could even say that the shaman and the patient should abide by and respect in order to be safe and get the most out of the plant medicine. And first, I was lucky enough to have this experience in Peru. And like you had mentioned before, there's a lot of preparing for a serious endeavor like this. Because it has an MAOI, you can't be consuming several foods or drugs which could kill you. There are a lot of drugs which should not be combined with ayahuasca because it's dangerous because of the MAOI. So you have to have an understanding of that, and you have to fast from several things, which aren't just physical, but emotional. You're supposed to fast from sex for some time, and alcohol. To get yourself in this, I am doing this to heal myself point of view. And then once you are actually ready on the day to experience the medicine, there's a shaman, and I would say it's ill-advised to use this medicine without a shaman or someone who is very experienced with it, because the shaman is so integral in one's experience. And so that speaks to like what you were saying about the intention and the environment that is comprised in therapy. So we were lucky enough to have a wonderful shaman who had been administering this plant medicine since he was 14, I believe. His first experience was when he was 8 and hosted his first thing in his tribe at 11. And then at 14 went out to the public and was hosting this. And, it was deeply entrenched into his culture's point of view. So like similar into as, was it Mazateca in Mexico, and how mushrooms are part of their society and their culture, where they were before we ravaged it. And it wasn't viewed as a taboo thing. And it's not in Peru, where ayahuasca ceremonies are taking place. This is the one medicine that is used for treating almost every chronic condition. The shaman said to me, if you have diabetes, for instance, is one chronic condition that is claimed to be treating very well. If you have diabetes, depression, addiction, some other malignancies can be treated with multitude of herbs, but there's one that is always contained in it, and that is ayahuasca. And it doesn't necessarily directly work on your physiology to heal you of some of these conditions like you would expect. So how do you benefit from a hormonal imbalance like diabetes from something which we don't know directly works on the hormones? That's part of this deeper story, which is very valuable to be explored. So what's actually happening under the influence of ayahuasca in a controlled therapeutic shamanic setting that provides the platform for the body to heal itself, or opens up a new pathway for healing that the body wasn't previously experienced with. And in my opinion, that is the core factor in psychedelic medicine, which separates it, is its power to bring about novel thought patterns and new algorithms of thinking. And when that happens, the body can see and feel and know itself in a different way, which prevents itself from being caught in whatever pathological pattern it was.
The point about it being very culturally contextual, the usage of these plants, like this culture had it, this ceremony along with this plant were embedded in the culture, and this other culture had this. And what we're missing in Western culture is we don't really have that, except towards substances like alcohol, coffee. Those are like the culturally accepted substances for altering the mind state, right? Because the whole premise is these plants alter the mind state, and that's why they're used, because they're psychoactive. They change how you think, they change how you perceive. But in a culture like ours, where there's so much focus on always being, in sympathetic drive, the grind, get things done, being very energetic, very young, things like caffeine and coffee are very integral to the culture. And there's a kind of cultural, even mythos of, caffeine and coffee. And, there's people who are like coffee aficionados, and they know all the different brewing types and the smells and the beans.
I look forward to the day that is happening with psychedelic mushrooms.
And it's, you'll ask a girl out on a date, and it's, you want to get a cup of coffee. There's this cultural context for this substance called coffee, which is a drug in the same way as anything else is. And then, at night, back, pre-COVID times, where bars and the scenes like that were more active, you go and you imbibe this liquid, and it changes your state of mind. And there's, music playing, and it's like this bass drum beat, bum, 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 and everyone's dancing. And it always strikes me as very reminiscent of shamanic cultures of, the communal gathering together, imbibing some substance, dancing, singing, the kind of drum beat aspect of it. Although it's interesting, it typically doesn't have that holistic healing element in bars. It has more of the, Dionysian fun aspect, more of the pleasure aspect, more rather than the deeper connection aspect. So we have those substances within this culture. They're just different substances. And the interesting thing is those substances are so different than the psychedelic ones, because drinking, tons of alcohol and dancing, it could be great and cathartic, but it doesn't, heal you from, your problems. It doesn't necessarily bring clarity to the mind or give you new insights. And of course, they're very dangerous. I mean, alcohol addiction is a serious problem in this country and in other countries. And it's one of the few substances actually that if you rapidly discontinue, you can actually die from the withdrawal. It's one of the few known to all of humanity, a substance that you can actually die from the withdrawal. Like, you have to be careful, even stopping the substance. It becomes so ingrained in the body and such a, detrimental factor. So we have those substances, but these alcohol, other substances, tobacco. We have cannabis too in Oregon, which is
and we have kind of,
cannabis has a kind of minorly psychoactive effect in comparison to these psychedelics. But when you do the edible form, which goes through a different pathway, because when you ingest it goes through liver metabolism and creates another metabolite, which is more potent than THC, more psychedelic. That's basically what we have here, other than, as far as legally speaking, for altering consciousness. So cannabis is a step forward in that sense, because it does offer people an opportunity to experience altered states of consciousness in a positive setting. But the psychedelics are still to be seen how they integrate in the culture. And if this bill does go through and they become available for therapeutic use, it's going to be incredibly interesting to see the massive rippling effect that it'll have. And I think it'll be largely beneficial. Of course, some people, there'll be some bad events with it. It's as with any medication. I mean,
medication.
In naturopathic school, we learn about different pharmaceuticals, and I'm studying for my board exams in a week. So I've been studying a lot of different pharmaceuticals, pharmacology, and you look at these substances, and you have to be careful of like how you dose them, how much you give them. You have to be careful when you're mixing them together. You have to be careful if someone has another condition you give it. So like the medicines we use already have an inherent danger in them. And it's the same thing with everything. Psychedelics in and of themselves, they have inherent dangers. And the whole reason to research and learn and experiment is so we can find out what the dangers are, so we know, and then we can use them, safely and for healing and for therapeutics, and have less of those events. Right.
And it's so wonderful that we have somehow, through wonderful organizations like MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, opened up our ability to now look into medicinally, statistically, how these drugs work. We can quantitatively have data to show that LSD and psilocybin have statistically more people can leave addiction and depression after a single treatment of them. And so I think really our main barrier to entry right now is how these drugs are branded. And I am confident that with the passing or even just the proposal of the legislation, like has happened in Oregon, that opens up and brings attention to this changing paradigm right now. And as we begin to recontextualize some of these taboo substances for what they were when the party situation came out, we'll be able to understand more about how they can actually help us. And, even still, we have a contextualized view of the drugs which are legal and regulated: cannabis, tobacco, alcohol. We see alcohol as, of course, it's deleterious and dangerous, probably the most out of any drug, in my opinion. And there are still healing values, like the cardiovascular value of having a glass of red wine every so often. But they pale in comparison to the risks and adverse events. So there was this person, I believe he was the person who was in charge of what would be the equivalent of the DEA in Britain. He was the board member who was supposed to bring statistical information on how they should schedule and treat their drug regulation. And he put a study out he was fired for, that compared the relative risks of all illegal and most popular intoxicating drugs. The top tier were alcohol, heroin, methamphetamine, and then it went down the line. And the lowest one was psilocybin mushrooms. So like you said, as we begin to explore medical value in any treatment, there will be adverse events. But what we can expect from mushrooms is that it would be orders of magnitude less adverse events than some of the drugs which we are currently treating people with every day, like amphetamine, which is Adderall. You take out one carbon group, or you add one carbon group to amphetamine, it is methamphetamine. And we are giving this substance to young children every day as their brains morph and become attached to their current state. We're giving them amphetamine every day. Isn't there a more practical, sustainable solution for some of our mental problems like that? And I think as we begin to see things in a different way, we will come into understanding of many new treatments for pathologies that we would not expect. For instance, the FDA had just approved, as you mentioned, ketamine as a treatment for major depressive disorder that is not responsive to SSRIs or needs to be effective immediately. So you have a person present that says, I'm suicidal, I have no time. You can't wait 14 days for SSRIs to kick in. You can't talk them out of it. A useful adjunct therapy is ketamine infusions, which they're now using. And I think it was on average 10 to 14 days from a 130 milligram intramuscular infusion in a controlled setting. So you would go into the doctor, and what the FDA has validated through studies which have statistically shown this 30 milligram infusion of ketamine can statistically remove major depressive disorder in a matter of minutes, and last for a significant amount of time. And it doesn't have contraindications or, very many medical adverse events that take place in this way. But it's interesting because previously our understanding of what depression was maybe an imbalance of serotonin, right, or dopamine, and ketamine actually works. It's an antagonist for your NMDA receptors, which are involved in thought and your association with self. So how you see yourself, how you can objectively view your state of being under the influence of ketamine is valuable to your brain state. So although it doesn't directly affect serotonin or dopamine, it changes your thought form in a way that still is effective in reducing depression. So how we see what we previously thought of as understood or slightly understood pathologies is also changed by our understanding of the treatment now. So like I said, how psychedelics are the telescope to astronomy in a psychedelic sense, or in a pharmacological sense. How are we going to use that? Are we going to hopefully peer through this telescope and see a massive value for our species and the medical paradigm, and really shift our perspective towards one that is open and empathetic to people in that situation? I think for someone who has MDMA and has received, or has PTSD and has received MDMA treatment, to hear from those that he's maybe close with, or to see a group of public people talking about how MDMA is a party drug and no use for it, that's got to be not so fun for a person in a place like that, right? They would like to hear that their experiences are validated. And the more people that do experience a benefit from these substances, the more they will be validated.
Yeah, and I think the kind of cultural revolution of the late 60s and 70s, it gave a lot of insights into what psychedelics could be and what they can't be. So they're not a cure-all for all of society's problems or the world's woes. It's not as simple as, everyone just takes them and everything will be fine.
Right.
There's dangerous aspects to them too, especially for people who are very susceptible to different, pathologies of the minds and
right, schizophrenia and bipolar disorder potentially.
Exactly. But what we're seeing in the kind of reemergence is, I think there's going to be a more conscious and wise approach to them, and seeing them as they are, which is, as you were talking about, as tools. And how do you use
and
that
I think
tool?
we've seen that
and what
in
do you use
cannabis.
it for? Mm-hmm.
Like cannabis also is a fairly, not perceived as a fairly benign intoxicating substance. However, it can be not so benign, and it can be scary. And, especially if you're ingesting cannabis, you can overdose on it quite easily. The means in which cannabis was legalized was through public support, rebranding of how dangerous the drug actually is, like we were just talking about, statistically supported studies on its value medicinally and exploratively. And now we've got to this place where we can and are starting to finally be real about cannabis. Yes, it is holds value in anti-inflammatory sense, right? But yeah, it can be dangerous, or it can be misused. And we're now having an honest discourse finally in cannabis about where its healing world is, and where we need to take heed when exploring the medicine. So that conversation, I think, is one we will now begin to see, and I've already started to begin to see in psychedelics and plant medicine. So
because there's that oft repeated statement by people who I would say overuse cannabis. Like they're just, they're basically always high. They're all day, every day. And they'll say something along the lines of, well, it's healing and it's medicine. My question is, medicine for what? Like medicines are for something. They're not. Like,
and in that way, they're using it as a symptomatic treatment.
Yeah.
It's not a nature cure. They're not treating the root cause of whatever it is. Maybe it is satiating whatever, imbalances within them, but that is not treating the root cause. And I think that's problematic, honestly, in the cannabis culture right now, and is not helping our movement in the psychedelic culture. But yeah, it is very real, and how real we can be about the intoxicating values of these substances is important, so they can be potentially regulated and utilized one day in a medical context. Because if we were to just say, you know, cannabis is fine and everybody can have as much as they want and they won't have a problem, that is how drugs become back regulated and enforced to a more stringent degree that prevents our exploration of them, you know? Mm-hmm. So I think we're beginning to become real about psychedelics now, and we're beginning to see that we don't really understand exactly the mechanisms for how so many of them work. Like I was saying, ayahuasca is a bit cryptic. But even on a deeper level, I think a lot of tryptamines in particular, one of the root molecules of the class of psychedelics, bring about a change in your energetic profile or your aura, right? What you are made of is not purely physical. And so now we're starting to explore exactly how your aura affects your physicality. You know, Chinese medicine is entirely based on energetic manipulation. How do you move certain energies in your body through herbs or acupuncture that affect your physiology? And I think that we will begin to utilize psychedelics as a poignant medicine for altering our energetic profile, which will translate to physiological healing. And I think that is a beautiful time to be alive right now in terms of what we're understanding about energy and how that translates to our physiology. But it's a very untold story right now. So how our energy actually looks and behaves, and then furthermore responds to psychedelic medicine, is a bit foggy right now. But the promise behind them is immense, because there's sustainable solutions that go really at the root. Because before your body is even matter, it is energy. And if you can really treat deeper and deeper back, then you can really hit a sustainable root cause solution. I look forward to our incorporation of plant psychedelic medicine into an energetic space as well. You know, like Reiki, Chinese medicine, Qigong. I don't think that's been under-researched, in my opinion. How do psychedelics influence and potentiate that healing process?
Right. I think a lot of the shamanic rituals in general, they tend to focus on the kind of meditative aspect of it. So those are those traditions. But what about all these new traditions of, you know, mindfulness meditation and Qigong, as you were saying? What happens when they get utilized? And it's an incredibly common experience for someone who doesn't even believe in energy. In a psychedelic experience, they feel it, so they can't not believe it. It becomes like an apparent experience. So on the topic of experiences, what have your experiences with these medicines really taught you? What insights? Any particular stories you have about specific experiences you had?
How long we have?
A long one.
I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
So, I guess first, just because we were just discussing it, I'm not sure I was completely sold into the esoteric, unexplainable magic nature of our universe until I was confronted with psychedelics. You know, this is the way it is. The world's matter. You die and you're done. And then, like I said, psychedelics provided me a platform of openness, and literally the way they work, rewiring neural pathways, gave me insight into how potentially there is a deeper story that might not be explained by the dogmatic scientific enterprise right now. And that was the beginning of the healing cascade that came from psychedelics with me, was I began to think, well, maybe there is a deeper story than I understand. And you know, in addition to that, I have seen, I guess it's really different for each substance in each person. But personally, I have noticed immense benefits in my thought forms, in my questioning my own self. Is this a healthy manner in which I'm living? And is this sustainable? Through the use of LSD and psilocybin, I think they deliver similar lessons. I would say psilocybin has a bit more of an organic, heartfelt vibe, and LSD maybe a bit more pragmatic, but they both have truly opened up my person in how I track and view my growth as a person, physically, mentally, emotionally. It has made me review myself and take important data into how I'm living in the world, into how I might want to further progress my life, and I think that is part of the reason that they have been so effective in treating addiction, is that they provide a means for understanding how your current situation is not sustainable, and that there are other thought patterns that are out there. It's common in addiction treatment centers to, I know Smart Recovery is one of the ones that uses an algorithm that challenges your previous bias and thought on a particular subject, and how you misunderstand that subject leads you to act in an irrelevant or unsubstantiated response, right? So you respond to a certain stimulus in an inappropriate manner because your bias on that stimulus is untrue. For instance, go into work, you think everyone hates you, so you're not going to talk. You're going to be holding back when the inference that everyone does not like you and the reason for you holding back was never true in the first place. Psychedelics, we have now shown statistically, have a capacity for opening up that view of your own biases. So that's been incredibly valuable and useful to my progression. And then physically, the anti-inflammatory and how would I describe it? Consciousness enhancing aspects of psychedelics have really provided I'm fairly confident I would not be feeling as good as I am in my own body with my spondylolisthesis and whatever's going on musculaturally if I had not taken lessons from some of these substances. So a lot of people will talk about and try to describe how connected they feel with themselves and with everything under the influence of LSD or psilocybin or what have you. And that awareness, I think, and visceral awareness of the body both provides a conscious and unconscious platform for healing. So there were moments, I'm very into yoga and teach yoga and things like that, but the actual true understanding of my body came after I used psychedelics. Yoga deepens that. And they are both tools, they both are the shovel that allows us to dig deeper into our understanding of our physiology. And some psychedelics do that viscerally without really much work or intention, like we were talking about, necessary. They show you the parts of your body. And if your body and mind can unconsciously understand where pathology is, one of the tenets of naturopathic medicine, the body knows how to heal itself and is intelligent. So showing the body, all right, here, check this out. This is where it hurts. And, breathe into this, be aware of this spot, maybe an energetic lockup or an emotional tension. Just the awareness of that on a conscious or unconscious level opens things up. So I've noticed that capacity very strongly in, LSD, psilocybin, and ketamine as well. I look forward to seeing how the rebranding of ketamine as well as fit into this psychedelic revolution, renaissance. Right now, I think it's probably the least accepted of the psychedelics in a medical context because does have a potential for physiological damage if you use it all day, every day. For sure, it's not healthy for you. But used medicinally, I think there's far more value in just treating major depressive disorder, like we've now figured out on the FDA. I think there's a strong value, at least as I can vouch for, in its capacity to allow us to explore parts of our body which maybe were too painful to get to, right? Ketamine's an anesthetic. And then lastly, spiritually, it's really tough to disambiguate or describe. Words are blunt instruments when it comes to talking about something as organic as your energy and your spiritual soul body. But I definitely feel as though my spiritual understanding and my place with myself spiritually has orders of magnitude progressed since I've utilized these medicines. And some of the deeper work you do on ayahuasca can be very cryptic and esoteric seeming, like, what does this soul body have to do with me? What's my karma from past lives have to do with my space now? But I think there is a understanding of people who might participate in these medicines already that working with, understanding, and exploring your spiritual body through the use of these medicines has a rippling effect into your physiology, your physical body, your emotional and mental well-being.
Terence McKenna once said that the fundamental function of psychedelics is boundary dissolution. It removes boundaries of, this is me and everything else. This is my environment. This is another person, or, boundaries that we set up in our own minds of like rigid ways of thinking or ideas, or, boundaries that, that culture and society sets up of, separating people out based on what they look like, or, what job they have, or all these different conceptual boundaries. And what it does, it seems to dissolve those boundaries out and let you, at least for some period of time, experience what reality is uninterpreted without the boundaries, and see how strange it actually is, how mysterious. And that experience alone of that's even possible to experience, that kind of experience is possible for human consciousness. That is a revelation in and of itself that you can never undo, because once you see that state, you see, oh, what I call like reality and the world is really just this one narrow mode of consciousness that, that people exist in, because they go to this job and then they drink some coffee and then they go home and they watch TV, and like this narrow band of consciousness. But you can travel outside of that band of consciousness through psychedelics, or through, ritual meditation, through music, through dance, through being in nature, and a shift. And it reminds you that it's possible, that if you feel like you're isolated, you feel all alone, that you're just in this narrow way of perceiving, and it's incredibly difficult to bring oneself out. But psychedelic medicines at least offer a potential catalyst for that process, because they show you,
beautifully said,
that's possible. So, why isn't that possible while I'm in ordinary consciousness? So they show you what you can reach without them. Ultimately, I think would be the goal of psychedelic medicines is, that's possible.
Yes.
So now you figure out, how do I actually live in that state without it?
I'd say one of my favorite books I love to recommend to people is called The Book of Not Knowing, essentially describing the value of living in a space of not knowing, because everything we are is a conjecture of what we previously understood about the world. And then you have something happen to you and you respond with bias, like we were talking about before. And then you add a layer of what you perceive as yourself that may be based on a false conjecture. And then how do you get below that false conjecture of yourself if you are living within it? I don't know who discovered water, but I know it wasn't a fish. We are constantly immersed in this perception of self. How are you to escape from that perception of self? And dissolving the boundaries of your own ego is doing exactly that. And to describe it in a medical context, Robert and Carhart Harris has done a beautiful job of showing this stepping out of yourself and stepping into your new self, maybe, can be described through the deactivation or lessening of activity in the default mode network, right? This is the default mode in which your conscious mind relates to the world around you. You have ruminating thoughts that repeat because you're in the water. That's how your fish is going to perceive it, right? But when psychedelics lowered the activity in your default mode network, bam, now I'm out of the water. I'm a fish out of water. I see what's really going on here, and I can redefine myself without those false conjectures from something, maybe a traumatic event that happened to me. And so, trauma and releasing old holding patterns is valuable with MDMA. It's also valuable and potentially accessible through other psychedelics, LSD, psilocybin, DMT, ketamine. They all have that similar motif behind it, I think. And I'm very much excited for witnessing the unfolding of this new medical paradigm and psychedelic renaissance.
Me as well. I think that's the perfect place to finish this off. And I'd like to thank you, Frank, for being on the Herbal Hour and speaking about the herbs of changing the mind and soul, which have been used for thousands of years, which are just as much of a part of herbalism as any other plant is, and we'll continue to discover and see what the future holds in terms of using them therapeutically. I certainly hope that bill goes through, because I think that would bring immense benefit, especially using it in psilocybin in such a controlled setting where you have a therapist in front of you and you can really have someone work through the issues with you. It eliminates pretty much any of the negative consequences that can come from the
good.
more,
you're safe.
Yeah, exactly. Because at least you have that feeling that you're safe and that they're trained to be able to deal with, if something start going down a bad place, they're trained to be able to, let's explore that. Because the resistance to it is usually what caused that terrible trip. But thank you, Frank, for being on the show. And
it's been my pleasure, my friend. I look forward to utilizing some of these methods in my practice one day, and I'm excited for your practice developing, man. I'm proud of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, man.
Awesome. Thank you, Frank.